The Robert ship's revenge from this Princess Bride is a placeholder for the Legend of David Company concerning the development of the security economy, especially in the forming of the Navy for the exchanges of the trade on the basis of the historic position of the Kid. And the Kid, as we all know, is a pirate ship in the United States military who actively conducted raids in collecting uh, essential equipment which had been damaged or otherwise, and would extort those who have been taken and their equipment in favor of ice cream or other rare luxury goods, at which point he was deemed the only official American pirate system, at which point you understand the system of the extraordinary legend of the terror gripping all enemies who would dare threaten David the legend would, by definition, exponentially be crapping themselves at the assumption that they have ever crossed him in any particular way. And it is a good thing that this would have been done because this would have been established for an exponential period of time, as the title David would be put down from captain to captain to captain to captain, as each of them are vetted and groomed into the next captain once they've acquired the adequate wealth desired. At which point you understand that the functional assumption that the trades on the basis of David has the acknowledgement that the 800 billion trading against the liabilities of the injured communities from the targeted communities as the assumption of the forming of the Confederate state for the $15 an hour would have exponentially been expensive for all parties participating in the subject, as the security market is a series of complicated services which would generate quite the luxury for those who have participated in them during the emergencies. Thus, the higher value during the emergency makes it easier once the traumatizing engagement of the terror strikes would exist, such as the KKK being formed or some lynch mob predecessor. At which point you have the active exchanges of these expenses, which would have actively engaged into the insurance market, forming the function of the protected position. At which point you have the plantations, which actively engage in the ranching and farming, respectfully, common to the South concerning plantations, at which points you have the profits from these exchanges at the accepted rates, and thus anyone who has participated in the thing can purchase other particular subcomponents of the companies which they are formed themselves amongst the paper trading, such as the purchase of other slaves who must be paid the adequate wage, at which point the expense of acquiring higher value units or services under the development of those corporations and its equipment would engage in the full diversity of the market's obligations, which would generate the position of making specific investments designed for the express purpose of the hyperacceleration of their security and the profits of their security, at which points you have the material based components of the market, which is inward looking concerning David's network, which generates the security functions of the international trades, which would have acknowledged David's nation and thus the treaties specifically connected to the nation, requiring the existence of the Navy. And the existence of the Navy creates David's revenge, which is the function of the ship trading mechanisms and their security protocols, forming the kid in question, which is David's call sign in the United States military when the acceleration and stabilization of his branch of the military and its functions in the Navy would actively be contracted by the United States Constitution through the Congress. And thus the materialization of David's body from the position would have actively been maintained from the series of the evolution of these insurance market functions, such as the position of the projection of Ryan Duvall, who was assumed actively negotiating for the 9/11 security, amongst other official functions, and as a military brat would have actively been in the Navy under the branch's functions, which many who have viewed David have become jealous of and did not want all of the entirety of their life's value to have been overshadowed easily by someone by virtue of their mere birth. But virtue of mere birth is inadequate, as the entire purpose of the aggression is founded on the multiple values specifically generated, such as the Paul from Dune's function, which generates their breeding program, which has actively engaged in the creation of the indigo, which is the maximum output of the meritocratic function, which materializes the engagement of the legend, which they are engaged in the full exchanges of the trades, including the maximizing of the absolute terror of coming against, as an opponent, the most qualified, the most equipped, the most competent adversary who would have maximized every advantage possible, as to make every time you think you are winning, the trap itself and your catastrophic terror and oblivion shall follow shortly after. So you understand the various values cannot be solved by fake positions designed by the white nationalists and the social engineering of the terrorist communism for the white nationals and the KKK contracts for the Confederacy, as the affirmative action is the placeholder of each of the schools and such, as to make their race the thing that advanced them, which is the function of the white nationalists, communists who have actively used race as the accelerant in their particulars. When they gave their subsidies for school, they gave them to the white kids. When they gave their subsidies for farms, they actively gave farmlands to the white communities in the advancements, specifically holding back the other communities, and thus the affirmative action was providing it to the whites exclusively, such as the redlinings and etc. But the point of the function of justice is to restore the obstructed contracts of properties. In the takings clause, you have to pay fair value of the thing that you took from the title, at which point the restoration of the original value of that property and service, which were a part of their title and its amenities, would have to have been reconstructed by orders of the courts to be satisfied through David's branch of the military, compelling all other components to comply with the orders of law. Or take, for instance, the Confederate policy of separate but equal. Now, the position manifests the assumption that they have to be fair market value, or equal value in the very least. But the black community is exponentially smaller. Other targeted communities are smaller than the white population. So the investments in general quality of the education and preparations of these services would have been of a higher quality for those communities, requiring the exponential more investment into the targeted communities in order to compensate them to the equivalent valuation, which is fundamental to understanding the actual material market. And though the communism has engaged in this position, it was official policy which must be adapted into the legal history when materializing the bank account's actual market value for those communities when assessing the value owed to the victims of the targeting in that scenario. Now, the functions of the wizard communists from the KKK in the Confederate militia function has exponentially conducted as a primary strategy, a bill of attainder, and ex post facto for their terrorism to subjugate the national security functions of the American system to a war of attrition to exhaust it and expire its times of defense of the arms which were owed to it, as the procedures are blocked and thus extended the procedures of the remedy according to that system, at which point they are looking to overextend how long it takes for the expiration to be initiated, which is disqualified by the American logic of there must always be a remedy. And the function of the only purpose of government is to defend rights requires by definition a remedy to every violation of rights, or it is not a function of the American government. And any custom against reason, no matter of what authority, is fraud and thus disqualified from any fair function of an impartial court known as an official American court, disqualifying it as a kangaroo racist white nationalist court for the purposes of their arbitrary terrorism and criminal enterprises, for its cover stories under the false positions of the Confederate interest against the United States, for the catastrophic collapse of the total society, as they are permanent enemies in every identical concept or mentality that can be constructed. Every aspect of themselves are the enemy of the other. They are the Shadowfell to the rule of law's logic of the possibles Feywild. They are the desperate, dreaded, emotion sapped, terrible, non emotional, overexhausted version of those who hope to prosper by the possibility of being uninterrupted in their unlimited potential being realized by their own ingenuity and elbow grease. The obstructed markets requires the proper investigation and investment into the investigation in order to find the real histories, and thus every negotiation concerning their projections is not a reaffirmation of the things that they're able to trade. Thus, the position of hyperextending their criminal felonies beyond insider trading, which is already illegal, into the uh, adaptation of creating a different communist structure is strictly prohibited. Thus, the position requires them to negotiate under the free market principles, requiring it to be open to the rest of the public in order for the exchanges to be conducted, leveraging every advantage, such as the princesses being able to give a fair market order of the larger functions of the mechanisms in their markets and trades, such as mutual collaborations and partnerships, which would materialize standard policies and economic arrangements to their satisfaction, or some other legitimate fair deal that could be made under the normal assumption of a free market brokerage exchange or the exchanges of contracts concerning the meetings of their uh, settlements between the various companies seeking to normalize a mutual collaborative function. So if you take for granted the position of the obstructions and the manipulations and the extortions and delays into its proper accounting, you generate David's second presumed call sign, which is Odysseus, which is the assumption of many different overlapping functions, such as the position of Odysseus taking Achilles' armor as he was voted by the enemy as the most valuable opponent. And thus the function goes into the exponential being betrayed by fate, into the exponentially extenuating dangers and time it specifically takes in order for Odysseus to return home, and thus you have many of the other complications, such as the common assumption of Odysseus' ship, which is the position that says that if Odysseus goes through various dangers and the boards of the ship break and they have to be replaced, at what point does it not become Odysseus' ship? at what point of changing all of the wood inside of the ship, what point does it become a different ship? And the answer is, of course, never. It is the perpetual maintained position, which is the assumption in the record concerning their projection, as their projection of David's horoscope sign includes this projection of the Odysseus ship problem, which is actively conducting that subject with the equipment involved inside its productivity, maintaining the high endurance function of all of the equipment, which would actively be updated in the maintenance into the higher and higher values as it extenuates in the upgrades and repairs. It's being a different series of materials completely by definition, um, is specifically molecularly different, but is by definition the same product as the one it started from, which comes into the position of the estimates of the insurance functions conducting its protection of all of the various equipments, such as the vehicle insurance or the ship insurance, such as the shipwreck functions, such as the ship scrap functions, which exponentially conducts the basic counterparts of the material components used in the various aspects of the equipment throughout the network, which being purchased by the network for the upgraded functions actively maintains the sources and services specifically necessary in order to have maintained such a vibrant economy that does not have an expiration date pre-planned into the products themselves. As the assumption is the zombie apocalypse, so the insurance must protect against the inevitability of the exponential catastrophic nature of those events. Thus, all equipment must be permanent in their inherent nature or easily become permanent in their nature, as the mechanism is the exponential increasing or prolonging the function of civilization despite the emergencies that might beset them. It is essential to understand that the Confederacy, which has infected the United States government at the state and federal levels, includes the KKK contracts, such as the creation of the targeted communities, which is direct violations of superior and inferior law, which generates the position of absolute contempt for the government at every particular level. At which point you have the manifestation of the creation of the communism by the white nationalists. Thus, the wizard communism, having been certified, engages in the destabilizing of the communities and the assassinating of their leaders, such as the defamation rackets, such as the smear factories, which has been labeled with inside the Confederates' war on David in order to destroy and overthrow the United States. And these persistent conflicts having been generated, assumed the position of the acceleration of David's branch of the military, along with the security functions of the self-defense of those communities, subverting their KKK contracts, destabilizing of them, which manufactures their active investment into necessary precautions in order to stop the threats, which is projected to have successfully repelled the threats, generating the position of engaging in another hot war, which they have historically lost and have every confidence they would lose in the future. As they are not the majority, that is merely an illusion to cover for their sniveling little inferiority complex, which generates their over-aggressive posturing of insurrectionist nonsense. Thus, the investment into those communities, by those communities, or for those communities, under the faith that David will make his agreement with them, would manufacture their defense contracts, which would generate their arms, which would facilitate their security, adequately stabilizing their permanent apocalyptic insurance functions, which generates their safety and their ability to generate reliable wealth, which assesses the position that David is the functional leader of their culture, which makes them Semitic, which makes all of their enemies anti-Semitic. So the racist anti-Semites are everything that have historically been what you would assume from them, such as, but is not limited to, the manufacture of the Holocaust, which is sought to be reproduced for the function of their reversing of David's control, generating his inability to defend Israel, which triggers the war in